Today's speaker is Steve Kelly, Mammals in Our Midst. About our speaker, Steve grew up in Brownwood, Texas, and spent most of his youth out in the country learning about wildlife. He's a 1978 graduate of Texas A&M College Station, majoring in wildlife and range science. He worked with the USDA for 28 years, involved with rural lending for community development and utility infrastructure projects. He ended up as the state environmental coordinator for the agency in Texas. He started Kelly Environmental Consulting in 2005, which provides environmental assessment and analysis, along with wildlife habitat evaluations, primarily for water and wastewater projects in rural areas throughout Texas. Steve and his wife Kathy have lived in Sun City since 2012, with a brief hiatus over in Leander for 2 years. They both love traveling out to the Trans-Pecos area to find and document snakes and a wide variety of wild animals. Steve, you have it.
Okay, I hope everybody can see this. Does that screen look all right?
Looks good.
Okay, we're going to talk about some mammals today that are here in Sun City, and we'll hope this all works technically correct and we can all have a little bit of fun watching this. This is the Reptiles and Mammals Special Interest Group. We expanded reptiles and amphibians and mammals to include mammals because we didn't really have a group in the nature club that represented mammals. And I get a lot of questions about those. There are many species of mammals that call Sun City home for all or part of the year. There's far too many to cover today in this short program. And a lot of you are from Texas or grew up in rural areas and are familiar with some of these animals. But we also, as y'all know, we have a lot of people here in Sun City from all over the world that aren't familiar with all of these. What exactly is a mammal? We'll go through the boring technical stuff here for a minute. But the Merriam-Webster dictionary says it's any vertebrate versus non-invertebrates like spiders and things like that of the class Mammalia, having a body more or less covered with hair, nourishing the young with milk from the mammary glands, and they give birth to live young, with the exception of a few mammals that are called monotremes. These are the egg-laying mammals. We don't have these in Sun City, but just for the fun of it, I thought I'd throw these in. There are 5 species of monotremes, or egg-laying mammals, still in existence. 4 are species of the echidna, and the other is a duck-billed platypus. These are found only in Australia and New Guinea. And there's a typical picture of an echidna and a duck-billed platypus. Sun City, we have mammals fit into 4 different groups. The insectivores feed primarily on insects. The herbivores that feed primarily on plants. Omnivores, they feed on both plants and animals. And the carnivores that primarily feed on meat. That's a start. Let's take a jump right in and look at some of the species that live here. There's a lot of bats in Texas, but I only picked one here, and it's the most common. It's called the Brazilian or the Mexican free-tailed bat. I won't bore you all with all the scientific names, but I included them as much as possible. This little bat's found all over Texas, and they're both resident and migratory. There's some caves around central Texas, such as the Bracken Cave, that have as many as 20 million bats annually. I'm sure a lot of y'all are familiar with the bats down in Austin, and there's a huge population of bats under one of the bridges where the railroad passes through in Round Rock that you can see during the summertime. Bats are estimated to eat up to 18,000 metric tons of insects in Texas each year. Bats are also the primary carrier of rabies in Texas. Over 95% of all rabies cases in Williamson County since '98 were connected to bats. And by that, I mean the strain of rabies was a strain that related it back to bats. Although bats are extremely beneficial to our ecological balance, it's best to observe their flight, but never pick one up or touch one if you find it on the ground. We have 33 total identified species of bats in Texas. We do not have any vampire bats in Texas. Now let's switch gears and go into, I guess, the biggest herbivore we have here and the most common ones, the white-tailed deer. We won't spend a lot of time on deer because all of you see deer all the time and you're familiar with deer. Sun City has a resident population of approximately 450 to 600 deer. Population levels are primarily determined by the weather, with drought having the greatest impact. Deer breed during the late fall and begin having fawns generally between April and June. Twins are not abnormal, especially when there's adequate food and cover. The deer in Sun City survive by eating a combination of woody and herbaceous plants within the native range areas remaining, as well as landscape plants, as many of you know. Feeding a deer is not allowed anywhere in Georgetown. However, the feeding does not play a significant role in their survival here. It's just not consistent enough and there's not enough volume to it, but we shouldn't feed deer anyway. One common misconception about the deer is that they'll eat everything. They're browsers, unlike cows, which are grazers. And therefore, deer don't generally eat grasses. Their diet requires a higher protein content, and therefore they're more selective. But that's not to say deer won't pull up, chew on, or just simply play with landscape plants. The primary predator deer is a coyote, which we'll cover shortly. Among the other herbivores or plant eaters in Sun City are the cottontail rabbit, the jackrabbit. The swamp rabbit is possibly here, but I don't know that we have a confirmation of that yet. The eastern fox squirrel, the hispid pocket mouse, the white-footed mouse, the deer mouse, the cotton rat, and there's possibly more. I threw that possibly more in there because we do have some instances of possibility of both beaver and a river otter being seen in Berry Creek at some point in the past. Next are the omnivores. These are the mammals that eat both plants and meat. In Sun City, we have several species that fit in this group, and these are the ones we're kind of going to focus on a lot today. The fox squirrel, which y'all are all familiar with, the raccoon, the ring-tailed cat, also called a miner's cat. It's not a cat at all, it's a cousin of the raccoon. The eastern striped skunk, the possum, which is called a Virginia possum. We say possum, it's opossum technically, I guess, but in Texas, they're possums. Nine-banded armadillo, the gray fox, and the coyote. We could do an entire 45-minute program on each one of these and not cover them completely. So we selected some of the most interesting out of this group. The eastern fox squirrel. Squirrels are rodents whose front teeth never stop growing, much like rabbits. They're considered omnivores due to their food source, which includes nuts, acorns, insects, and one of their favorites is bird eggs, which is why you'll see birds chasing them from time to time. Squirrels can free fall as much as 20 feet without injury due to their amazing ability to turn and position their bodies in midair. Squirrels breed at an average of 10 to 11 months of age, and they can produce 2 litters a year, with 3 as an average litter. This is a little picture I took with my game camera, and I was just trying to show the speed of how fast squirrels can react to something on the ground. I hope it plays okay. We'll give it a shot. If you saw that squirrel, he did about 3 flips in midair as he was going along. I did my best to slow this down into slow motion, but here's all I ended up with, even in slow motion. You can still see it's really fast because squirrels have the ability to do that. Next animal we'll take a look at is the raccoon, which the scientific name is Procyon lotor. Interestingly, the Latin lotor means washer. Raccoons do in fact wash their food or dip it in water when water's nearby. And why do they do this? It used to be speculated that it was to wet the food to compensate for dry salivary glands. We now know that raccoons are highly tactile. They want to wet their paws to increase the feel and gain more sensory information about the food object. Some of you may have seen your green drain caps that are out in your yard. If you have downspouts that go out in the yard and you have green caps that keep popping up mysteriously during the night, and that's because the raccoons go out there and pull them open. There's water in them a lot of times, and they can access that water. Raccoons are common throughout Texas. They're opportunistic feeders and highly intelligent. Some researchers believe, based on the number of neurons in the brain and the IQ test, raccoons are smarter than both cats and dogs. They're adept at avoiding traps, learning to open cans and bird feeders, as many of you can attest. Here again is a short little video. It is about 30 seconds long, but we're going to watch it and see because it gives a really good example of how this raccoon not only is able to get to this bird feeder, but he's intelligent enough to be able to access it. He goes around the snake guard and hangs upside down. And here's the interesting thing. You can see with his back legs, he's not just forcing the bottom off. He actually has figured out that he can turn it and it'll unlock at some point once he turns it far enough. He's trying to get to that food and he's figured out how to do it. Next species we have, which probably most of you haven't seen here in Sun City, is the ringtail. They're also called ringtail cats or miner's cats. They're a member of the raccoon family. They're about the size of a large squirrel, and they're extremely shy and pretty much totally nocturnal. They feed primarily on reptiles, eggs, insects, fruits, and berries. We do have a population of these in Sun City that reside primarily along the river bottomland where they can remain hidden. Another one of their favorite foods I didn't list there are berries from mistletoe. You'll find them in the winter, sometimes eating mistletoe at night. The striped skunk, or eastern striped skunk, scientific name is Mephitis mephitis. The word mephitis means pungent, sulfurous, or stinking, which is no surprise. We have one known species in Sun City, which is the eastern striped skunk. These skunks can have a very different stripe pattern, from almost totally white on their back to almost black to just a normal stripe. This is a picture of one, just a still picture I was able to catch behind my own yard. And you can see this skunk was interesting because he's almost solid white on the back. This resembles what is a hognose skunk you see out in West Texas in places, but it's actually a striped skunk. It's not a hognose. Skunks are largely nocturnal, but if you see a skunk out in the daytime, especially on cloudy days, it doesn't necessarily indicate it has rabies. Skunks are known in Texas to be the second highest carrier of rabies. However, many skunks are suffering from distemper or mistakenly thought to have rabies. Distemper is more of a cold weather thing that afflicts skunks in early spring or in the winter, where rabies is a warm season disease that gets them. Breeding season for skunks is generally February through March, with young born 60 to 70 days later. That's why you see a lot of skunks get hit in the road this time of year, because it's breeding season. They're running around looking for mates, and they run in front of cars and they're not fast enough to get out of the way. Skunks are fairly gregarious, and the young generally stay with the mother throughout the fall. Even after that, they sometimes share dens and stay in small groups. Skunks are omnivorous, their primary food being insects, followed by eggs, small reptiles, or birds. They're preyed on by hawks, owls, foxes, coyotes, and bobcats. Probably the great horned owls we have here in Sun City control the skunk population as much as anything. In the wild, skunks rarely live beyond 2 years, and they're especially vulnerable to vehicles. As a defensive measure, the skunk raises its tail, stomps its front feet, and is capable of spraying a very strong musk that causes burning in eyes and nostrils and nausea if you get close enough. And one of the things that's interesting that people sometimes don't understand, a skunk can release its musk without raising its tail. They'd only do that during extreme duress or near death. I hear people from time to time say they've trapped a skunk and they're safe because it can't raise its tail, so it can't spray. And I just have to tell you that's never been my experience. The possum. Possums are interesting. They're the only marsupial or mammal that carries their young in a pouch in North America that's north of Mexico. Possums are generally solitary and they begin mating in January to April. The mating period only lasts about 36 hours, then they go their separate ways. It's interesting how many mammals are solitary and they don't mate. There's probably more birds that mate for life than there are mammals. Baby possums are born after only 11 to 12 days of pregnancy. Unfortunately, most people would not select a possum to win a beauty contest. Newborns with between 5 and 20 litter mates, they weigh only 0.2 grams or 0.067 pounds. The young crawl into an abdominal pouch where they remain firmly attached to the same nipple nonstop for 7 weeks. There are rarely more than 12 nipples, so some will not survive. A number of predators are a threat to possums, resulting in an average lifespan of only 2 to 3 years. And if you see this female possum, it's no excuse for it, but you can see probably why the male doesn't stick around, because they don't want to deal with all of that. Contrary to popular belief, possums do not primarily feed on carrion. Their diet consists of rats, mice, reptiles, frogs, fruits, and vegetables. And interestingly, they consume thousands of ticks every year. Possums are highly immune to snake venom. Studies have shown that antivenoms may soon be developed from a component in their blood. They aren't 100% immune, but they can take a lot of snake bites and be pretty much unaffected by it. They also do not contract rabies, likely due to their low body temperature. And yes, possums can play dead. This is a healthy possum, and he's just playing dead. The 9-banded armadillo. Armadillo was declared a state animal of Texas in 1995. However, it's not a native species here. They belong to the family that includes highly specialized anteaters and sloths that inhabit South America. The first armadillo was recorded in Texas in 1849. Armadillos eat earthworms, insects, small lizards, which they locate by a very strong sense of smell. Their eyesight's extremely poor, which is why they can be walked upon and never notice a person. Probably the most interesting fact about armadillos is their reproduction. Breeding occurs in many armadillos in July, although the implantation does not occur until 14 weeks later in November. Armadillos have quadruplets, always have 4 young of the same sex. They're identical quadruplets and they're all either male or female, and they're born in March to May. Young armadillos are born fully formed and they can walk immediately, although their shells are a little bit softer than an adult. The gray fox. Gray foxes are fairly common in Sun City. They're social and they'll stay with a mate in a monogamous relationship throughout their whole life as long as their mate survives. Foxes select dens in rock openings, under decks, even in hollow trees or any place that provides shelter. They're primarily carnivorous and feed on small mammals, birds, insects, reptiles, as well as persimmons, yaupon, and hollyberries and acorns. I know I had a lady call this year and she was out walking along Sun City Boulevard with her dog and a fox started following her. And she realized that the fox wasn't really a danger to her or her dog because a few minutes after that, she saw some baby foxes run back into a hole from where the fox had come from. That was a female fox, and she was just concerned and wanted to know what the lady was doing close by and with the dog to make sure her pups were safe. I have had people call me also that have foxes that have decided to have young underneath a deck if there's an opening there. The gray fox is an excellent climber. I have actually photographed a gray fox in a tree that was sleeping during the middle of the day. I hope you can hear this. It's the sound of a gray fox barking. It's a really strange sound. If you didn't pick up on your computer, you can always Google it online and find that. They have just a weird bark to them. And they will follow around and they'll bark at dogs and other things, which doesn't mean they're about to attack. It just means they're curious and they're just barking. Now the coyote. Coyotes are the only large dog-like appearing animal in Sun City. There are no wolves that occur here or anywhere in Texas. The far eastern edge of Texas, there are reportedly a few possible red wolves or red wolf crosses with coyotes, but they're very, very rare even there. Coyotes' food consists of small mammals, birds, reptiles, fruit, insects, and yes, deer. They will feed on deer, especially young fawns and grown deer from time to time. Those that are in poor health are the most susceptible. Coyotes form families or packs. A male and a female will remain together throughout the year, along with offspring from litters that average 6 pups. Coyotes are very territorial and communicate by calling and scent marking. The big question we have here, are coyotes dangerous to humans? Coyotes have been hunted, poisoned, and killed throughout the U.S. as many as 20 million coyotes in less than a century, and they still survive due to their adaptability to survive even in an urban environment. It's not hard to do an online search and find some story of a person being attacked by a coyote. What needs to be considered, there are millions of coyotes in Texas. From a friend of mine with Texas Parks and Wildlife, a biologist that's out of Bastrop that covers Central Texas, named Kelly Simon. She quoted in an article, according to the Centers for Disease Control, about 4.7 million dog bites occur annually in the US, resulting in about 16 deaths a year. However, there have only been 160 recorded cow on human attacks in the US in the 30 years preceding 2006, and only 2 caused fatalities in North America, and the vast majority of those were in California. Coyotes are extremely curious, and they'll often follow or come closer than normal to someone out on a trail, especially if they have a small dog. However, that does not necessarily mean they're aggressive. While it's true that a coyote can attack small dogs as a food source, it's a somewhat rare occurrence, which is generally limited to an unattended pet outside at night. There's no record of that happening in Sun City, at least the last time that I contacted the CA office. Just spotting a coyote during daylight does not mean there's any danger. They move around, they get startled, and sometimes they'll just run around in the daytime because they're looking for food. Stories of coyote behavior in California or Chicago is not a good source of information for Sun City coyotes. This is a picture I took with a game camera behind my house. We regularly have a few coyotes that pass through here along the creek. I did have an 8-pound small Chihuahua mixed dog for years until last year. And this coyote would stop at night and I think look over in the yard at that dog, and the dog didn't know it was 8 pounds, and it would bark and the coyote would run away. You can see here, the coyote looks nothing like the gray fox, so you should recognize the difference. Here's another sound clip I had. Let's hope this comes through because you can hear these coyotes calling here in Sun City if it's clear and if they're close enough. And this doesn't mean that the coyotes are about to attack somebody. Sometimes they're just saying, this is where we are, or we just had a good hunt, or just communicating with each other, or just howling. It's just what coyotes do. And I know I've seen people from time to time, they'll send me pictures and they'll say, is this a coyote or is this a gray fox? And when you look at them side by side, you can tell there's quite a difference. Our gray foxes have a entirely different look and size and height versus a coyote looks much more like a dog. Now the bobcat is the only true carnivore we have here. Bobcats are found throughout Texas. The females generally have a home range of 1 square mile, so they move around quite a bit. Even males can range much further. They weigh approximately 12 to 30 pounds and are 20 inches tall at the shoulder. The bobcat's the only obligate carnivore found in Sun City, which basically means they have to have meat to feed on. Bobcats are experts at stealth. Their primary food consists of mice, rats, small reptiles, birds, and rabbits. Although capable of killing a small dog, an attack would be extremely rare. I've only captured 1 bobcat on a video here in Sun City. They have a way of avoiding people as much as possible. Now a couple of animals will kind of bring us close to the end here. The feral animals. They're domestic animals that have turned wild. Here's the cute ones, which are the cats, and the not so cute ones, the feral hogs. Nobody seems to want to love a feral hog, and they're not really lovable. Feral cats are amazingly adaptable and many are capable of survival in the wild. They're also very good at reproducing at a rapid rate. The biggest problem with feral cats is their predation on birds and reptiles, which can cause significant declines in these animals and cause an imbalance out in the environment. Coyotes, foxes, bobcats, hawks, and owls feed on feral cats. I've actually seen a coyote capture a feral cat and eat it. And I know that's hard to take for cat lovers, but it's probably a good control that we have here. This is a typical feral cat in Sun City. We hear from time to time stories about black panthers. We have no black panthers here. This is just a large feral cat. Feral hogs. Feral hogs are not native to North America. The hog's very intelligent animal has proven to be extremely adaptable. Over generations of breeding in the wild, the feral hog begins to look less and less like the homegrown family farm hog and more like a wild animal. Here's a picture of some typical show pigs that people may take to a livestock show versus your feral hogs. They're both the same animal, but the feral hogs have been out in the wild, figured out how to survive. They've gotten longer hair, coarser, and they just have a pretty rangy appearance. Problem with feral hogs is the potential damage they can cause to yards, fences, etc. Hogs are social and they form groups called sounders. The females are called sounders that can number up to 50 or more and have rapid reproduction rates. Due to hogs' numbers and strength, an entire yard can be dug up in one night. In Sun City, there are occasional groups of hogs. They move through the bottomland, primarily of Berry Creek, from time to time, and they'll come into Sun City and tear up yards, dig up irrigation systems. Well, it's true feral hogs can be aggressive. They're very intelligent and they generally avoid contact with humans. If you talk to people that have tried to hunt down the feral hogs here in Sun City, they're very hard to find and catch up with because they can hear you coming, they can smell you, and they're smart enough to stay out of sight until nighttime. Adult feral hogs basically are not preyed on by any other animals. Currently, the only effective control of feral hogs is by capturing or shooting. Final note, Sun City is home to a wide variety of species of mammals. Many may not ever be seen by residents, but they're present and they're a valuable asset to our community. There's no trapping, shooting, or killing of any wild animal allowed in Sun City by non-professionals. Most store-bought repellents do not work very well. If you have problems with an animal or armadillo, whatever, never put mothballs out in an open area. The best control that I recommend for skunks, armadillos, and most other small mammals is cayenne pepper sprinkled liberally on the ground. And now we have plenty of time for questions. If y'all have any, I'll do my best.
Oh, there are always questions, Steve. And it was wonderful. It really was. We had somebody who brought up that they know deer are a hot button topic, but they've noticed how few deer there are in the Legacy Hills Park trail area. Is there any idea how the storm might have affected them?
There's no doubt that the storm is going to be hard on deer. And when you have severe droughts or severe freeze like that, it's going to hurt the population. And I'm sure that some deer were lost and didn't make it through, and they may still not make it through. But as far as seeing them in one particular spot in Sun City, the population stays fairly stable. Like I said, between that 450, 600 on average. They're resident deer, they live here. They have a way of hiding and moving around. People that hunt deer can tell you they can see bucks all year long on their ranch, and then they go out there the first day to hunt deer, and the bucks seem to have disappeared. So deer can hide pretty well as long as there's cover for them. It doesn't mean there's less deer necessarily just because you don't see them in one place at one time. Turkeys are a good example of that too. We have turkeys here, and some people see lots of turkeys and some people see no turkeys, and they vary from place to place during the time of year. They move around where there's food and cover for different times of the year.
Another question has to do with deer again. If you find a fawn by itself, what is the best thing to do? And the answer that we had provided was leave it alone. Its mother will be back to pick it up around dusk. How does that sound?
Absolutely. And I do get
Great.
calls, even though I'm a snake person here. A lot of people call me for non-snake animals like deer. Uh, we had a deer in the front yard of one of my neighbors earlier this year, and the lady was extremely worried about it because when she was walking by, the fawn got up and started following her down the road until it flopped down on the driveway. And she just was confident the mother would never find it again. But I advised her to leave it alone. And sure enough, mother came back and got it about an hour later. You should always leave them alone where they are. We've had a few fawns that get stuck in our fences. They go through the rails, and then one day they wake up and find out their hips won't fit through the rails anymore, and they'll get stuck in there. We've had to remove some of those, and we've been able to do that successfully. But you have to be careful with a fawn because even a fawn deer can kick and injure somebody. So you want to know that you're doing something you're familiar with. So always leave them alone and leave them where they are and nature take its course.
Okay, so are foxes aggressive toward people when they're out roaming our community? And we had an answer of no.
Never, never. I can tell you when my children were very young, I happened to end up by chance with some baby foxes that somebody accidentally dug up, and they had no mother. We lived out in the country, and so we adopted them. And my kids had them around. They're not tame. They're not good pets. They do start getting wild, and they can bite the older they get, but they just are not aggressive toward people. Foxes are curious, but not aggressive. It'd be almost impossible for anyone to ever have a fox bite them just randomly for no reason out in the trail.
Okay, I don't know if any of y'all could hear that. I have a titmouse outside my window who's decided wants to come in and participate in this. So it's knocking on the window. How about mountain lions, pumas? Do they travel through here?
You know, a mountain lion or puma, either one, the same animal, cougar, they have ranges. The females can have a range that's 75 square miles. A male can have a range that's 150 square miles. Uh, so they do travel, and there have been some in Williamson County that travel through. I spoke to one resident last year that lives backed up to Berry Creek, and he's been here since Sun City began. And after talking to him, he says he saw one day just come out of the creek and go up over the hill behind his house. And I was pretty confident that he possibly did see one because he lived there a long time. He knew what he's talking about. It wasn't his imagination. So it's possible. You never say it's impossible, especially we're not that far from the lake and some other areas. So one could pass through, but they're not going to take up residence here. It's just too many people to disturb them and not a good place to hide and to live for a long time.
Well, I think behind my house, I back up to Cedro on one edge of the community, and I would swear, and my husband will also, that we've seen a mountain lion. So I don't know. We've seen it a couple of times, but we haven't been able to take a picture of it. So,
I would never say never, but I'm a big advocate of game cameras if you live backed up to a wild area, because they're a little pain to keep batteries in and to keep them filled and changed out. But you can find some really interesting animals running around at night that you won't ever see any other time without catching them on camera.
that's a great idea. And now we have to find out, why can't we put mothballs down? Several neighbors swear by them, is what one of our viewers said.
Mothballs are a very toxic insecticide. They were never intended for open air. Years ago, people would put them inside chests and closets to keep the moths and other bugs from eating their clothes and cloth that was stored in there. But they're very deadly and very poisonous. It's unlikely a dog would pick one up, but if they did, it could poison them. Years ago, we had a little bit of a population explosion. It was probably about 2013 or 14. We had a population explosion of skunks. And one of my neighbors decided that she had put mothballs all over her yard to keep the skunks out. Because I'd go out at night in a golf cart, and one night I recorded 8 skunks within 2 blocks that I saw. And one of the skunks I saw regularly was walking around in her yard that had mothballs everywhere. So it didn't deter the skunk, but it could be terribly hazardous to somebody's pet or to some other animal that got insecticide, and it could do real harm to them. You don't want to do that. They're just never recommended. If you do some research, you'll find mothballs are never recommended to use out in the open air.
And you mentioned cayenne pepper is a good deterrent for some things, right?
Cayenne pepper works really well. A lady here in Sun City had a little rock cave in her backyard that was created by the original builders. And she had a large dog, and she noticed a skunk took up residence in the cave. And every night the skunk would come out and go out of her fence, and her dog would run out there, and she was afraid it'd be sprayed. And so we went over and liberally put out a couple of bottles of cayenne pepper all around the little cave. And sure enough, the skunk decided to move on. You can imagine an animal that has an extremely sensitive nose, like an armadillo or a skunk, sniffing up some cayenne pepper. I wouldn't call it cruel, but it's pretty unpleasant for them, and it's pretty convincing for them to move on when that happens and when they have to walk around in cayenne pepper.
Well, I think that makes perfect sense. Well, someone mentioned that someone at the end of Stetson Trail has a picture of a mountain lion in his yard. So that might be interesting to see.
I would love to see that. It was not far from that location. The individual that I talked to about seeing a mountain lion back there that would have gone back up over the creek and up toward Tranquility Trail. So I would never be the one to say it's impossible, but I would sure love to see the picture.
Well, I'll send you this person's name, and then maybe you can get in contact with him. And if you find it, it would be wonderful. We would all love to see it.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. Well, that's actually the last question that we have. Does anybody else have any additional questions for Steve? I mean, this has been fantastic as always with Steve's. What?
Why do they close the trails every time someone sees a coyote?
Why do they close the trail every? One more question came from inside my house. Why do they close the trails every time they see a coyote?
You know, people have a natural fear of coyotes, and there are people in Sun City that are very afraid of deer as well. They think that a doe that comes toward them is is being aggressive and is about to attack them. And coyotes sometimes, especially if you've got a pet, a small dog, and if the dog barking or yipping, coyote can approach. But we don't have any actual documented cases where somebody was attacked by a coyote. And I know a lot of people will argue that and say they knew somebody in California or they knew somebody somewhere that got bitten by a coyote. And I don't doubt that that could happen. But I really don't believe the warnings on the trails should alarm anyone. You know, I have no problem at all taking my grandson out on trails, and I've spent my lifetime in coyote country, and I've never had any problem with a coyote or worried about a coyote going to come after me.
Well, okay, that makes sense. And then one person did ask, does the CA provide enough food for the 400 to 600 deer that we have? Is that through feeders?
We don't want to we don't want to feed the deer. Uh, deer deer in my opinion, which some people disagree with that, deer tend to balance themselves naturally based on their food and cover. The more food they have, the higher their reproduction rate goes up. They'll have more twins. And so if you start feeding them, it would cause a population increase, and then you would have more problems because when that food stopped, they wouldn't have anything to eat. So that's the reason why we don't want to feed them. Now, feeding them, a few people throw out food for them here and there, and I know that upsets a lot, and they should not do that because it just gets the deer used to feeding on food that's not going to be there all the time. But it wouldn't be a smart thing just to openly feed the deer and increase the population that way. They'll balance themselves. And I compare the discussion on deer population, I compare it a lot to coyotes. I know we say the deer don't have the predators they once had. And this is a hot topic, and so I don't want to get too deep in it, but they don't have the predators they once have. And so we have to take extraordinary measures to control them. But if you want to compare another animal, look at a coyote. Coyotes don't have virtually any predators. What controls the number of coyotes is the available food and cover. So coyotes can reproduce pretty quickly and have large litters, but it's food and cover that controls their numbers. The same thing's basically true for deer. The only time that wouldn't apply is if you had a lot of deer in migrating in, which the more and more we've built around Sun City, that in migration has almost been cut off now because all of our exterior developments don't have open areas, large areas. And so we don't have the deer flowing in here like we used to have at one time. So these deer pretty much just live here and stay here, and they survive off of what's available to them. We don't want to give them any more food and help them reproduce faster than they do.
Okay, has deer trapping ended for the year? Do you happen to know?
There again, deer trapping is a very controversial subject, and there's people here that are on the wildlife committee, which I spent some years on. It has not. I believe the deer trapping will go through March. That's the normal time period, and so I think it'll continue up through the end of March, and that's about as far as it'll go.
Okay, and of course it is illegal to feed deer. Someone mentioned that. If we see a fox, is there any way, and this is our last question, if we see a fox, is there any way to not scare it away?
Well, a fox is going to run away. I've seen some really excellent pictures people have taken of baby foxes playing around in their yard in the springtime. And I guess if a fox thinks he's safe enough, he's going to stay around. But they would rather stay away from people because and that's a good thing. We don't want foxes coming up and being totally half tamed, because they are wild animals, just like all wild animals. People just shouldn't interact directly with wild animals because they do bite and they have the ability to cause you some damage. If you go pick up a raccoon, even one with distemper, it could bite you pretty severely. And we do have that happen here earlier this year down on Stetson Drive, actually, that you mentioned it. One of the residents called me. They had a young raccoon that had distemper that was totally disoriented, and they can't rescue one like that when it has a case of distemper. So we had to call animal control, and they came and picked it up to euthanize it. But you don't want to run out there and pick one up or something like that. It's just not safe to handle those animals.
Well, I can relate to that. And working in an ER, I can't think how many times we had to give a series of rabies shots to people who had touched wild animals and gotten bitten. And, they weren't able to capture the animal and we had no idea. And so we had to go ahead and give them the shots, as a preventative. Anyway, I just wanted to say, and everyone is saying, Steve, wonderful, again, wonderful presentation. We really, really appreciate it. And I just wanted to say thank you very, very much. And we hope you'll do another one for us sometime soon. So
Thank you all very much. And let's all hope that we can get together at some point and start having some meetings in person. That'll be great whenever we can actually make that happen.
you're right. Thank you again, Steve.